This particular image here is best looking at the midbrain and the circle of Willis. Let's start with the midbrain. This structure here that kind of looks more like a Mickey Mouse is the midbrain. The ear of the Mickey Mouse are the cerebral peduncle. This whole structure here is the midbrain. Next, we're going to talk about the circle of Willis, and I'll outline that for you. So this is the circle of Willis. At this level here, we have a series of vessels that forms a circle of Willis, starting this anterior cerebral artery. Then we have the internal carotid artery, internal carotid artery here, internal carotid artery here, anterior cerebral artery. The middle cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery, and then we have the posterior cerebral artery, posterior cerebral artery. Then we have three communicating artery. This structure here is the anterior communicating artery. This is the posterior communicating artery. Here's a second posterior communicating artery. And then here's the third communicating artery, and it's the posterior communicating artery. Moving on to talk about the lobes in this image, we have the frontal lobe, the occipital lobe, and we're still relatively low, so we're at the temporal lobe, the right temporal lobe here, the left temporal lobe here. Going to move superiorly. Next slide. So at this level, we're going to talk a little bit about the ventricular system. The ventricular system is made up of the lateral ventricle, the third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle. And to outline the lateral ventricle, this structure here is the lateral ventricle. Just to remember the CSF flow, it goes from the lateral ventricle to the interventricular foramen, which is right here, interventricular foramen of Monro. So the CSF is going from lateral ventricle to the interventricular foramen of Monro, where it collects more CSF fluid, down to the third ventricle, and then from the third ventricle it goes to the cerebral aqueduct, which we can't see here. Then it collects more CSF fluid to the fourth ventricle, which we saw earlier in the very inferior aspect of the brain, and it goes out to the median aperture and the lateral aperture. So that's the CSF flow. Now I just want to mention that there are two different colors of the brain, and this two different color shades here in this image, where the lighter color, this here are the lighter color shades of gray, is the gyride. The gyride made up of the gray matter. So all this, the lighter shade, is the gray matter, and that the darker shade, so here is the darker shade color, is the white matter. So next I'm going to talk about the basal ganglia and pointing the basal ganglia out. Here we have the caudate head of the caudate head nucleus, and then we have the lentiform nucleus, And these two structures make up of the basal ganglia. And I want to point out to you that the basal ganglia are the gray matter. Look at the shade here. It matches over here, the gyride. So that is the gray matter. The next structure that I want to point out to you is that in the lentiform nucleus, we have two other structures. Starting here is the putamen. So putamen over here. The globus pallidus right here. Globus pallidus. And then I want to mention that we have the internal capsule. This here is the internal capsule. And that the internal capsule is further divided into the anterior limb and the posterior limb. And similarly on the other side, anterior limb, posterior limb. And out here, this is the external capsule. External capsule. Notice that the internal capsule and the external capsule are white matter. See, it's kind of darker shade here. And then it's darker shade here. Next, we have this third ventricle. The structure here is the third ventricle. On either side of the third ventricle, the structure is the thylamus. So there's the thylamus. And then going further down, this is the occipital horn, or also known as the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle. Moving on. Next, I just want to mention that this here is the longitudinal fissure. This longitudinal fissure divides the head to the right cerebral cortex and the left cerebral cortex. And this concludes the end of the brain in the axial T2 weighted sequence.